Noir Plasma Chrome Bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Like what you share.
Welcome back, everyone. Okay, let's dive into this explainer. To truly understand the headlines we see today, we really have to understand the historical foundations that were set centuries ago. So today, we're taking a deeply structured journey through an absolutely immense intellectual and spiritual history. We're looking at Islam. Specifically, we'll be unpacking its core doctrines, its really rich scriptural foundations, and the incredibly complex evolution of its theology and law. Basically, we're breaking down the whole shebang, from the architectural structure of the Quran all the way to the intricate debates of classical and modern jurisprudence.
To help us navigate, here is our Foundations to Frameworks categorical roadmap, so you know exactly how we're going to deconstruct this massive intellectual history. We'll start with the structure of the Quran, jump into the prophetic Sunnah and Hadith, explore the schools of Islamic theology, unpack jurisprudence and social debates, look at the Great Intercession, and then finally wrap things up with a synthesis and modern outlook.
All right, Section 1, the structure of the Quran, the divine bedrock.
So the absolute foundation of Islamic creed, law, and morality is, of course, the Quran. Muslims believe this is the verbatim word of God, revealed to Prophet Muhammad over a 23-year period from 610 to 632 CE. Now, to really grasp it, you have to understand the three foundational pillars that organize its entire worldview. First up is Tawheed. This is the uncompromising recognition of absolute monotheism, the idea that God is completely unique, eternal, and has literally no equal. Second is Nubuwah, establishing the historical continuity of prophets, which ends with Muhammad as the seal of the prophets. And third, we have Ma'ad, the absolute reality of bodily resurrection and the final day of judgment. Basically, every single verse in the text connects back to one of these three core themes.
What's fascinating is that the physical structure of the text actually mirrors its historical context. The 114 chapters, or surahs, are split into two distinct phases. The early Meccan surahs use this highly poetic, really urgent language to focus on pure creed, cosmic proofs, and eschatology. But then look at the shift in the Medinan phase, and this brilliantly illustrates the contrast. After the Muslims establish a sovereign state, the verses become longer, they're more prose-like, and they focus heavily on practical legal ordinances, societal organization, and statecraft. It's totally crucial because it shows how the text evolved to meet the needs of a rapidly growing community, right? Shifting from establishing that spiritual core to building a fully functional society.
Moving on to Section 2, Prophetic Sunnah and Hadith, the structural beams.
While the Quran gives us the general injunctions, like, say, the command to pray, it's actually the Sunnah, the Prophet's custom, that provides the exact practical mechanics. And jurists are incredibly rigorous in how they categorize this custom. They break it down into 4 distinct steps. First, verbal, so the explicit things the Prophet said. Second, practical, his physical actions, like exactly how he performed prayers or the pilgrimage. Third, and I find this one fascinating, is tacit approval. If companions did something right in his presence and he simply smiled or stayed silent, jurists recorded that as a binding legal precedent of permissibility. And finally, the fourth, is descriptive. These are narrations detailing his physical appearance and his moral character. Now, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the juristic difference, the hermeneutical distinction made between these actions. Because not everything the Prophet did was meant to be a timeless law. Legislative sunnah includes acts intended to establish binding legal norms for all Muslims for all time. But non-legislative sunnah? That includes his natural human actions. For example, the Prophet's personal fondness for eating dates or wearing local Yemeni cloaks. That signifies general permissibility. It's not a mandatory religious law for everyone. Forever. Make sense? Centuries later, all these traditions were rigorously compiled into canonical collections using distinct epistemologies. The Sunni tradition developed the authentic six, with collections like Bukhari and Muslim, which are heavily focused on strict, unbroken chains of transmission and legal methodology. Conversely, the Shi'i tradition compiled the four books, and they rely on a different epistemology, where traditions are narrated directly through the lineage of the infallible imams, ensuring spiritual and legal authority comes right through the Prophet's household.
Okay, Section 3. Schools of Islamic Theology, the Intellectual Architecture. So, following the Prophet's death in 632 CE, an early political dispute over succession eventually morphed into highly complex, distinct theological systems. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Sunni orthodoxy dealt with the intense tension between human reason and divine text. On one side, you have the early Mu'tazila, who heavily prioritized rationality and argued for absolute human free will. In stark contrast, you have the Athari school, insisting on strict textualism, basically rejecting speculative theology altogether. And sitting right in the middle, forming the actual backbone of Sunni orthodoxy, are the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools. They utilized dialectical rationalism to defend the creed, carefully balancing revelation with intellect. But even between those two orthodox giants, Ash'ari and Maturidi, there are intense, super nuanced debates. To put it simply, just imagine a debate over moral accountability. Maturidis argue that human reason can actually figure out basic right and wrong on its own, prior to a prophet even arriving. Ash'aris, on the other hand, insist we only know what's right because God explicitly revealed it. They also differ on divine wisdom. Maturidis believe God's actions are intrinsically tied to his justice, while Ash'aris emphasize absolute, unconstrained divine sovereignty. Meanwhile, over in the Shi'i tradition, theology centered on the authority of the imam, and it eventually split into its own fascinating paradigms. Today, the Usuli school dominates contemporary jurisprudence, mandating that qualified jurists use rational deduction, or ijtihad, to arrive at legal rulings. Historically, this rivaled the Akhbari school, which completely rejected rationalist jurisprudence, preferring direct reliance on tradition. You also see the Ismaili focus heavily on esoteric, or batin interpretations, as well as the Zaidi school, which closely mirrors Sunni jurisprudence but maintains a very active, distinct political doctrine of leadership. Let's move into Section 4. Jurisprudence and social debates, the practical rooms. Here, we're going to impartially look at how classical fiqh, which developed in very specific pre-modern socioeconomic contexts, formulated its laws and how modern scholarship interacts with those frameworks today. Take family law. Classical jurisprudence establishes a complementary framework where husbands have strict financial obligations. Because of this, inheritance ratios typically grant males double the female's share, as it's explicitly tied to carrying that financial burden. Furthermore, classical texts conditionally permit polygamy. Today, however, contemporary feminist critics argue that these classical codes basically institutionalize economic dependency. Many modern reformists cite verses regarding the impossibility of complete emotional equity to push for modern legal prohibitions on polygamy altogether. We see a very similar debate regarding apostasy. Traditional jurisprudence uniformly classified the public rejection of Islam as a capital offense. They treated it not just as a shift in personal belief, but as active political treason and sedition against the state. Modern reformists, however, severely critique this. By pointing directly to the Quranic verse, "There is no compulsion in religion," they argue that classical capital punishment was strictly for wartime military defectors. They emphasize that modern frameworks absolutely must uphold absolute freedom of conscience. And regarding international and civic law, classical Islamic empires used the dhimmi system. Essentially, protected non-Muslim subjects were granted religious autonomy in exchange for a poll tax known as jizya. While historically this treaty-based system offered a lot more tolerance than many pre-modern European counterparts, contemporary political theory points out that this paradigm functions as second-class citizenship. Critics argue it fundamentally conflicts with modern constitutional equality and universal human rights. And these debates aren't just history, they are the exact arguments happening in constitutional courts across the Muslim world right now.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, the Great Intercession and Eschatological Narrative. Beyond the laws and the complex theology is a transcendent, incredibly dramatic narrative of the Day of Judgment, vividly detailed in the Hadith traditions. The canonical tradition known as Hadith al-Shafa'a paints a staggering picture. Humanity is gathered, waiting in immense, terrifying distress for 50,000 years under a blinding sun. In absolute desperation, the crowds seek out a major prophet to intercede with God, just to get the judgment process started. They go to Adam, but he cites his mistake with the forbidden tree and turns them away. They go to Nuh, but he cites his invocation against his people and also turns them away. The rhythmic tension in this narrative is just palpable. The crowds approach Ibrahim, Musa, and Isa, but each prophet, either overwhelmed by supreme awe of the divine or recalling past mistakes, refuses the mantle. Each one utters the exact same phrase of profound humility and terror. Myself, myself, myself. Go to someone else. The tension builds and builds as humanity literally runs out of historical messengers. Finally, they approach Prophet Muhammad. And unlike the others, he replies with calm authority, Ana laha, I am fit for that. It's an incredible climax. He journeys beneath the divine throne, falls prostrate, and is inspired with unique praises never before uttered. God commands him to raise his head and speak. By doing so, he achieves the praise station, interceding to relieve humanity's immense distress and officially beginning the general judgment for all of creation. It is absolutely the climax of Islamic eschatological theology. And finally, Section 6, Synthesis and Modern Outlook, Looking Toward the Sky. So how does a tradition with such deep classical roots interact with the fast-paced modern world? Well, contemporary scholars are utilizing modernist hermeneutics. To bridge the gap between classical, pre-modern rulings and modern realities, they rely on distinguishing between immutable core creeds, the theology that literally never changes, and adaptable historical rulings. By actively reviving classical jurisprudential tools like maslaha, which means public interest, and maqasid al-sharia, the higher objectives of the law, scholars aim to recontextualize historical texts. They're working to address modern governance and human rights securely from within an Islamic framework. Which leaves us with a truly provocative question. How can classical, historically bound texts continue to harmonize with rapidly evolving, universal modern frameworks? This is the immense, ongoing intellectual project of the modern Islamic world. It's a dynamic, constant balancing act between preserving an unbroken divine tradition and navigating the totally unprecedented realities of the 21st century. Thank you so much for walking through this incredibly rich intellectual history with me today. I really hope this explainer has left you eager to dive in and keep learning.
Like what you shares.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Noir Plasma Chrome Bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.